You know, I got to tell you, and I'll tell Orlando, I really appreciate the fact that he wakes us up in the morning. Wakes us up with good news. You know, now my challenge is to keep you awake for the next few minutes, but that's good news. Hey, I heard a story about a man living in London by the name of Alec Holden, who enjoyed 15 minutes of fame a few years ago, and he did it in an odd way. When he's 90 years old, Alec Holden walked into a betting parlor in London, and he was given 250 to 1 odds that he wouldn't live 10 more years, that he wouldn't make it to his 100th birthday. He took the bet. In fact, he wagered the U.S. equivalent of $200 that he would live to see his 100th birthday. 10 years later, he walked into the same betting parlor on his 100th birthday and collected the equivalent of $50,000 for making it to 100 years old. He told the press, there's a couple things that kept me going. A bowl of porridge every single day, a game of chess every single day, and especially in the last few years, every single day, reminding myself to keep breathing. That retired engineer said that when he hit 99, he knew he had to be careful. But he also knew that he had 50,000 reasons to keep breathing. And I think that's kind of encouraging for us to remember that to have something to focus on. It's good to have something to kind of look forward to and a reason to keep going. That's especially true when you find yourself going through a difficult thing, when you find yourself in the middle of a hard season. This morning we are wrapping up our But God series, and we're doing it with a passage that I think is those two words, but God, appear in a passage that is especially encouraging when you find yourself in a difficult season. So if you're going through a hard thing right now, you picked a really good day to be here. If you are not going through a hard thing right now, you praise God for that, but my encouragement would be put this message in your back pocket, because the time is coming when you will go through a hard thing. Hardships happen to everyone. I'm reminded of what the old comedian Jack Benny said when he received his very first Emmy. He stood holding the trophy and announced to all of America, "I don't really deserve this. But then again, I have arthritis, and I don't really deserve that either." So, whether you deserve to be going through hard times or not, the reality is we all go through hard things. In fact, if you remember, Jesus himself said in John 16, "In this world you will have trouble." It's one of Jesus' promises that we don't like to talk about so much, right? You don't see that on a billboard in front of a church. In this world you will have trouble. We don't put that on bumper stickers. We don't put that on a t-shirt. But we all know that Jesus was exactly accurate. In this world you will have trouble. And the issue becomes, how do you respond to that trouble? Because I think that's really kind of the bottom line. Not so much that we're going to have hard times, but I think the main thing is, how do we respond to that? How do we deal with hardship? So that's where we're starting this morning. Let's go ahead and dive into our text, our passage in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12. And I actually want to read several verses before and after the but God statement, because there's some really important things in this passage. I want to make sure we kind of get it all in context. Hebrews chapter 12, and we're going to begin in verse 5. The writer says this, "And you have forgotten that word of encouragement that addresses you as sons. My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you. Because the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he punishes everyone he accepts as a son. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as sons. For what son is not disciplined by his father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are illegitimate children and not true sons. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who have disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of our spirits and live? Our fathers disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in His holiness. We're going to come back to that verse. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Amen, anyone? Yeah, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. Okay, obviously this passage is dealing with discipline. In fact, he uses the word discipline 10 times in those verses. Most of us don't like that word. We don't like the word discipline because we don't really like to be disciplined. But the writer here wants to remind them of a different perspective on discipline, a godly discipline. And he wants to remind them of a different perspective on hardships as well. He calls it the Lord's discipline. And he uses two images here to kind of help understand what the Lord's discipline is about. He first talks about the discipline of a parent to a child and what that looks like. And we all know we would rather be disciplined by someone we love than by someone that doesn't love us, right? I would rather be disciplined by someone I love than a Hillsborough County sheriff. I just would. Different objective, different motives, the whole bit. So he uses that image. And then he also uses the image of a coach training an athlete. In fact, he uses the word train here in the text. The Hebrew writer is saying, hey, listen, God is training you. Same way a father trains a child. The same way a coach trains an athlete. He's training you. And of course, the big question is, okay, how does he do that? Well, we learn in verse 7. Endure hardship as discipline. He does it in the context of hardship. And you ask, well, what's a hardship? He doesn't say. He doesn't say because it doesn't matter. Whatever hardship you're going through, that qualifies. Endure hardship as discipline. He's saying, hey, have some perspective on what you're dealing with right now. And then he also uses that word endure. It's an important word in that passage. Because he's talking about some things that aren't going to resolve themselves overnight. He's talking about going through situations that you're going to have to endure for a while. This thing that you're dealing with, this situation that you're going through, it's going to be here for a while. You're going to have to endure that. Let me share a couple takeaways with you from this passage that I think are really key when we encounter hardships. Here's one, speaking of our response. When encountering hardship, we need to look for God's discipline somewhere within it. When you are going through a hard thing, you need to be aware of and look for God's discipline somewhere within that hard thing. There are times when we can't choose our circumstances, but we can choose our response to those circumstances. We can choose our perspective to our circumstances. The writer here is challenging us to look at hardships as discipline from the Lord. Now, I don't know if you've ever asked yourself that question before when you're going through something. I would much rather not be going through this. I don't know if you've ever asked, is God trying to discipline me right now? Is God trying to teach me something right now through this miserable thing? And the answer is yes. He is. He's trying to discipline you. He's trying to teach you something. He's training you. Well, what if it's something I got myself into? It was just my fault, nobody else's. Doesn't matter. What if it's something that it's exactly someone else's fault? It's not my fault. Doesn't matter. What if it's a situation where it's really nobody's fault? It doesn't matter. The verse doesn't qualify what kind of hardship that we find ourselves in. It just tells us to endure it as discipline. Listen, God wants to be somewhere in your situation. He wants to be somewhere. He is somewhere in your hardship, even if it is all your fault. Even if it is completely someone else's fault. They did it to me. Even if it is nobody's fault. Pay attention. God is somewhere in that hardship, and He's doing something. Which leads to a second thing that you need to hold on to. God's discipline is actually a sign of His presence amid the hardship. The fact that you're going through a hard thing is not a sign of God's absence. The writer here is saying God is not absent. He has not abandoned you. He's training you. He's trying to grow something in you. And it actually gets better than that. God's discipline is not only a sign of His presence in the middle of what you're going through, it's actually a sign of His love as well in the middle of what you're going through. Verse 7, for what son is not disciplined by his father? If you're not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are illegitimate children and not true sons. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of our spirits and live? It's a really important passage. Because there's a lot of people who go through hard things and they come to the conclusion of, well, God has left me. God is nowhere to be found because I'm dealing with this. Or, worse than that, they come to the conclusion, God has it in for me. I don't know why, but God's out to get me. Then, of course, there's the other side of that when we look at our lives and, hey, things are going pretty good. You know, my life is pretty smooth. God must be so pleased with me. He must be so pleased with what I'm doing because look how easy my life is right now. This text doesn't say either of those things. Sometimes it's God's discipline that is a sign that God is for you. You tell me, is it loving for a parent to give a child everything that child wants, whatever he asks for, at the pace that he asks for? No, obviously not. Well, the same's true with God. It's not just a sign of His presence in our lives. His discipline is a sign of His love for us. God's discipline proves that He is not writing me off. He's pulling me close. And what is amazing, kind of hard to understand, is the fact that God is okay with being misunderstood by us for a while. God's all right with that. God's okay with us misunderstanding Him for a season. Just like as a parent, when you discipline your children, they don't understand what you're doing. And they walk away from that discipline going, I hate my dad. Or my dad hates me. Or I think it's my mom's mission in life to ruin my life. No, that's their conclusion. Why? Because they don't know what you know. And they don't see what you see. They don't understand what you understand. It's exactly the same with our Father. And of course, again, the flip side of that is the parents who, I just want to be my child's best friend. And I want my child to make all of his own decisions. I'm not going to give her any direction. I want her to make all of her own decisions and, just grow up that way. As Dr. Phil used to say, how's that working for you? God's discipline is proof of God's love, even if we don't always see it, even if we don't always understand it, even if we don't always agree with it. His discipline is proof of His love, and He's willing to be misunderstood by His children because He loves His children. So often when we discipline our children, hearts are broken, right? Hearts get broken. Our children's hearts get broken. As parents, our hearts get broken. Kids, when your parents say, this hurts me as much as it hurts you, it really does. They're telling the truth. You're probably aware of the old parenting adage of little heartbreaks now beat big heartbreaks later. And that is so true. That little heartbreaks now beat big heartbreaks later. And more times than not, let's just be honest, when discipline is used, pain is involved. There's pain in discipline. But you know what? There's pain in life, right? And God disciplines us because He knows that the pain of discipline beats the pain of regret every single time. The pain that you're going through when you're being disciplined beats the pain of regret later on every single time. And little heartbreaks now beat big heartbreaks later. So here's another takeaway. God's discipline is a sign of His commitment to our good, our righteousness, and our peace. The writer says this in verse 10. Our fathers disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in His holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. God's discipline is always moving us toward our good. Godly discipline always results in patience, in encouragement, in righteousness. And the writer here is not talking about just a little bit of patience and encouragement and righteousness. He's talking about a whole lot of patience, encouragement, and righteousness. He calls it a harvest. This is a harvest of patience and encouragement and holiness and righteousness. And isn't that exactly what you need when you're going through a hard thing? Don't you need the patience to see where God is at work? Don't you need encouragement? Don't you need some hope to hold on to? That's exactly what godly discipline results in. David Brooks is a writer for the New York Times, wrote an article entitled, "What Suffering Does." Let me share with you just a paragraph from his article. We live in a culture that is awash in talk about happiness. In one 3-month period last year, more than 1,000 books were released on Amazon on that very subject. 1,000 books in 3 months on the subject of happiness. However, when people remember the past, they don't only talk about happiness. It's often the ordeals that seem most significant. People shoot for happiness, but they're formed through suffering. That's from a New York Times writer. People shoot for happiness, but they're formed through suffering. Have you noticed that the words discipline and disciple come from the same word? There's no such thing as a disciple of Jesus who is growing in his discipleship that hasn't been disciplined by the Lord. And I'll tell you this. Sometimes God disciplines you, and it's not because you're doing something wrong. Sometimes God disciplines you and you're doing things right. Remember the two ideas that are at work here. One is a parent disciplining his child. The other is a coach disciplining an athlete. Mark, you've coached all your life. Did you ever stop coaching when they finally got it right? No. That's when you coach harder, right? When they finally start getting it right, that's when you coach harder. Why? Because you want to take them to the next level. They're doing great, but we want to take them to the next level. Here's good news. It's football season, okay? The Bucks play today. Do you know that Mike Evans still practices every day with the team? If you don't know, Mike Evans is one of the best receivers in the league. He's going to be in the Hall of Fame. He's the best receiver on the Bucks team, and yet he goes to practice every single day. He's still being coached. He's still being trained. Why? He's caught a lot of footballs in his career. They want him to catch a whole lot more. He wants to catch a whole lot more. So he's still submitting to that discipline. He's still submitting to that training because he wants to go to the next level. Sometimes the discipline of the Lord doesn't necessarily mean you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it comes during those times when you've been walking with him, but it's time for him to take you to the next level. Remember what Jesus said in John chapter 15? I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit. Then check out this next line. While every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes. Wait, what? Every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. Do you understand what he's saying here? How does God reward fruitfulness in your life? He prunes you. He gets out the pruning shears. Wait a minute, if I'm being fruitful, shouldn't I be congratulated? Shouldn't I be praised? Shouldn't I get some time off? Jesus says no. No, if you're being fruitful, the gardener, my Father, is going to take out the pruning shears and he's going to prune you some more. Why? Because he wants you to be even more fruitful. He wants you to take you to the next level. So here's another takeaway, and this is a good one. In God's discipline is God's healing. Look at how this passage closes. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. In other words, as I continue to walk according to the wisdom of the Lord, according to the instruction of the Lord, in those hard days, there's going to be healing that sets in. There's going to be a wholeness that comes from it. And God's discipline is God's healing. So I'm going to continue to walk according to the instruction of the Lord as best I can, and I'm going to pay attention. And I'm going to look for something transformational happening in my life, even when I'm going through a really difficult thing. I know a lot of you have gone through physical therapy in the past. Some of you are going through physical therapy right now. We know what that involves. It involves something that's in your body, a shoulder, a knee, an elbow, something that's been injured. It's not working right. So you go to physical therapy and they start working that elbow, right? And it hurts. Oh, it hurts. I don't want to do this. It hurts. But we know why we're doing it. We're going through that discipline because this body part isn't working like it should be. And the goal is to get it back to working exactly like it should be, like it was created to work. Godly discipline is to get us back to being who we were created to be. Because in discipline, there is healing. So let me share with you 3 things that I think you can do right now if you're in the middle of a hard thing. 3 things that I think will be beneficial. And the first is this. Identify what it means to submit to the Lord right now. Identify what that means, what that would look like for you to submit to God right now. The Hebrew writer says, how much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? Again, hardship and pain is not optional in our lives. How we deal with hardship and pain, that is. Growing through hardship and pain, that is. Hardship and pain, however, don't guarantee growth. And hardship and pain don't guarantee wisdom. Sometimes we think they does. Well, look what I've gone through. I had to have grown so much. I've got to be so much wiser. I've seen people go through some real hardship and pain, and they haven't learned what they needed to learn yet. Hardship and pain is not optional. Growth is. But growing involves submitting willfully to the Father's will. What's that look like? What does it look like? Well, in James chapter 1, James is talking to people who are going through some very difficult things. And he says this. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. James is telling people how to deal with hard times. If you're in the middle of something hard, James says, ask God for wisdom. Now notice, he doesn't say, ask God why. Ask God what is going on. He doesn't say that. He says, ask God for wisdom. By the way, let me say this. God's okay with you asking why. He's not offended by that. It's okay for you to ask, what is going on? I'm just saying there comes a time when we have to move past that. Ask God for wisdom. Because he's promised to give us wisdom. He hadn't promised to explain himself. He doesn't need to explain himself. He hadn't promised to tell us why. But he has promised to give us wisdom. Wisdom for what? Well, maybe it's wisdom to be able to see things from his perspective a little bit more clearly. Maybe it's wisdom to know what to do next. Maybe it's wisdom to know a little bit more about God or learn a little bit more about myself. I don't know. I'm not wise enough to tell you exactly how he's going to answer that prayer. I'm just saying he will answer that prayer if you ask for wisdom. Here's a second suggestion. Take the test with an open book. If you're going through a hard thing right now, if you're going through a test, open the book. It's an open book test. I used to love it in school when the teacher would say, okay, this test is going to be open book. Yes. Because I knew somewhere in here is the answer. All I got to do is find it. Scripture is such a gift when you're going through hard things. This passage in Hebrews 12, did you notice what the writer does? He quotes Proverbs. He quotes their Bible, the Old Testament. But then he does something earlier that's even, I think, neater than that. In chapter 12, the beginning of chapter 12, he tells them this. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. That's how chapter 12 begins. Since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. The writer says, hey, you got a bunch of people sitting in the stands of heaven watching you right now. Who are these people? Go back to chapter 11. He lists a whole bunch of brothers and sisters, men and women from the Old Testament. Maybe they'd forgotten about them. We call it the Hall of Faith. You know, we're familiar with the Hall of Fame. This is the Hall of Faith. He reminds them of all these Old Testament men and women. And every single one of them went through hardship. Every single one went through hard things. Saying, hey, folks, you're not the first. Other people have gone through it as well. What's he doing? He's taking them back through the book. He's helping them take the test with an open book. I had a good friend in college who was a year ahead of me. And we had the same major and we were on the same track, which meant all the classes in my core study, biology and chemistry, that I was taking, he had taken the exact same classes with the same professor the year before. He gave me all of his old tests from every professor that would give the tests back for me to study, which was really helpful because I was studying what that professor tested them on last year, and I knew if I can do pretty well on an old test, it's really going to help me take this new test that's coming up, my test. And sometimes I'd be sitting there and they'd put the test down and I'd turn it over and it would be the exact same test that I'd been studying from. The exact same test. And I'm like, this is great. I'm going to smoke this thing because I already know the answers. I've been studying this exact test. And by the way, that's on the professor. That wasn't on me, okay? Just so you know. Look around for a minute. There are a bunch of old tests in here. I stand by that statement. There are a bunch of old tests in here. There are a bunch of people who have already gone through some of the very same things you're going through right now. You know, we think that our situation is so unique. And listen, I am not dismissing or I am not discounting the pain of what you're going through. I'm just saying other people have gone through the same thing. And you can take advantage of their wisdom. And you can take advantage of their experience. You're not alone. Why does God want you to take the test with an open book? I think it's because of what Paul says in Romans 15. Such things were written in the Scriptures long ago to teach us. Why? They give us hope and encouragement as we wait patiently for God's promises. The Scriptures teach us patience. They give us encouragement. They give us hope. Take the test with an open book. And then finally, I'll suggest you talk to others during the test. Talk to others. In high school, my entire high school career, I sat either sitting in front of or beside Roger Thornton. Alphabetical order, S, T. My entire career, I sat beside Roger Thornton. Roger was not only my best friend, he was the smartest kid in school. Far and away. There are so many tests that I took that I would have loved to turn around and talk to Roger. I'm telling you, I would have done so much better in high school if I could just turn around and talk to Roger during a test. However, they frowned on that where I went to school. Listen, God does not frown on that. Okay? God encourages you talking to other people as you're taking the test. You and I were never meant to face hardships by ourselves. God wants us taking tests, talking to others, talking across the table. You know, one of the biggest lies that the enemy is going to tell you is, you're all alone. You aren't. You are not all alone. Proverbs 17:17 says, a brother is born for times of adversity. A brother is born for times of adversity. I'm convinced that for every hard thing you face, there is a brother or a sister who has been born again to help you face that adversity. Because a brother is born for adversity. That's why we make such a big deal about community here at Bay Area. That's why we think it's so important to be in each other's lives, why we stress this Acts 2:42 focus. It's not just so we can get together and enjoy the good times. It's so we can lean on each other during the hard times. So we have somebody to talk to, somebody to lean on, somebody to get encouragement from as we're going through a hard thing. And speaking of talking to someone, be sure you're talking to the teacher. Okay? A lot of people never talk to the teacher. Talk to God. You're going through a hard thing right now, ask God to take it away. We can do that. Ask God to intervene. Ask God to do something about it. He wants you to do that. But if He chooses not to answer your prayer the way you hope He will answer your prayer, pray for wisdom. Pray for wisdom and look for God's transformational power somewhere within that situation. See it as godly discipline. We can't always trace God's hand, but we can trust His heart. When you don't understand what God is up to, what God is doing, you might not be able to trace His hand, but you can trust His heart. And when the writer says, but God disciplines us for our own good, that we might share in His holiness, God is not writing you off. He is drawing you close. And you need to remember that. When you're in the middle of a hard thing, God is not writing you off. He is pulling you close. I hope you've been encouraged by this message. I hope that you spend some time in prayer thinking about this message and what God is up to in our lives. We're going to sing a song of encouragement in just a minute here. If there's something going on in your life right now and you need to pray for wisdom, for healing, for strength, for patience, if there's anything that we can help you with, we invite you to meet us here at the front of the auditorium. Let's go ahead and be standing and we'll sing.